Long before hospitals and pharmacies, mysterious figures roamed the countryside with leather bags filled with herbs that could save lives or end them. They were part doctor, part mystic, part outlaw, and their secrets died with them in the shadows of history. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the misty dawn of medieval Europe, when church bells marked the rhythm of daily life and superstition danced hand in hand with faith, certain children were born with something different in their eyes. Not the pale blue of winter skies or the warm brown of fertile earth, but something deeper, a knowing that seemed to pierce through the veil between the seen and unseen worlds. The calling to become a healer rarely announced itself with fanfare. Instead, it whispered through small moments that others might dismiss as coincidence or childish fancy. A young girl would place her hands on a wounded bird and watch it flutter back to life. A shepherd boy would know instinctively which plants could soothe his flock's ailments. These children possessed what the wise women called the sight, not the ability to see the future, but to see through the present moment to the deeper currents of life and death that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary existence. In the village of Thornwick, nestled between rolling hills covered in ancient oak forests, lived a blacksmith named Godwin, whose daughter Meredith displayed such gifts from an early age. While other children played with wooden toys or helped their mothers with simple chores, Meredith would disappear into the woods for hours, returning with bundles of plants that she arranged in careful patterns on her bedroom floor. Her mother, Eliza, initially dismissed this behavior as harmless childhood games, until the day their neighbor's infant son fell gravely ill with a fever that had already claimed two other babies in the village. The local priest had performed his rituals, sprinkling holy water and muttering Latin prayers, but the child's condition only worsened. In desperation, the mother brought the baby to Eliza, knowing that strange children sometimes possessed unexplainable gifts. 8-year-old Meredith took one look at the burning infant and disappeared into her collection. She returned with a handful of white willow bark, elder flowers, and something the adults didn't recognize. A delicate purple flower that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Without speaking, Meredith began to prepare what could only be called a potion, though she had never been taught such things. She crushed the bark between two stones, steeped the flowers in warm water heated over the fire, and added 3 drops of liquid she somehow extracted from the mysterious purple bloom. The mixture gave off a sweet, earthy smell that seemed to calm everyone in the room, including the frantically crying baby. When Meredith fed the concoction to the infant using a small wooden spoon, the change was almost immediate. The fever broke within the hour, and by morning, the child was nursing again. Word of the miracle spread through Thornwick like smoke from a signal fire. But it brought both wonder and worry. The villagers were grateful, yet they whispered among themselves about the unnaturalness of such power in one so young. Not all who possessed healing gifts lived in quiet villages. In the great city of London, where the Thames carried both commerce and disease through its muddy waters, a different kind of calling emerged. Thomas, the son of a wealthy merchant, showed no interest in his father's trade, despite the comfortable life it promised. Instead, he spent his time in the city's darker corners, drawn to the suffering that lurked in narrow alleyways and cramped tenements where the poor struggled to survive. Unlike Meredith's intuitive connection to plants and natural remedies, Thomas felt pulled toward the more brutal aspects of healing, the cutting, the bleeding, the desperate interventions required when disease had already taken hold. He would sneak away from his family's comfortable townhouse to watch the barber surgeons work in the public squares, learning to ignore the screams as they amputated gangrenous limbs or lanced festering wounds. Most children would have fled in terror, but Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him as he observed these procedures. He seemed to understand, without being taught, which cuts would heal and which would prove fatal. The calling manifested differently in different regions and social circumstances, but it always carried the same underlying characteristics: an ability to see beyond the surface of things, an unusual comfort with the boundary between life and death, and most importantly, an overwhelming compulsion to ease suffering wherever it was found. These future healers could not simply walk past a wounded animal or ignore a person in pain. Something deep within their nature demanded that they act, even when they lacked the knowledge or tools to help effectively. Many of these gifted children grew up in families where healing knowledge had been passed down through generations. In the Scottish Highlands, the MacLeod clan had produced healers for over 2 centuries, with each generation adding to their accumulated store of knowledge about which plants grew where, when to harvest them, and how to prepare them for maximum potency. The clan's matriarch, Moira MacLeod, could trace her lineage back to ancient Celtic druids who had understood the sacred relationship between human health and the natural world. But even in families with strong healing traditions, the calling had to manifest itself naturally in each individual. It could not be forced or artificially cultivated. Moira's eldest son showed no aptitude for the healing arts, despite years of careful instruction, while her youngest daughter, barely 5 years old, could already identify medicinal plants by touch alone, even in complete darkness. This selectivity added to the mystique surrounding healers and convinced many people that their abilities were divinely ordained. The church's relationship with folk healers was complex and often contradictory. While official doctrine held that all healing power came from God and should be channeled through ordained priests, practical reality demanded a more flexible approach. Priests could perform rituals and offer spiritual comfort, but they possessed little practical knowledge about treating wounds, delivering babies, or combating disease. The population's health depended heavily on folk healers, creating an uneasy coexistence between religious authorities and traditional practitioners. Some healers tried to bridge this gap by incorporating Christian symbolism and prayers into their practice. They would bless their herbs in the name of the Trinity, make the sign of the cross before beginning treatment, and attribute their successes to divine intervention rather than their own skill. This strategy offered some protection from accusations of witchcraft, though it was never entirely foolproof. The calling to become a healer was not always welcomed by the families of those who displayed such gifts. Parents understood that this path would likely lead their children away from conventional marriage and family life, into a world of danger and suspicion where a single mistake could result in accusations of heresy or worse. Many tried to discourage their children's interests, pushing them towards safer occupations like farming, craftsmanship, or trade. But the calling was not easily suppressed. Children who tried to ignore their healing gifts often became restless and unhappy, unable to find satisfaction in ordinary pursuits. The pull toward healing was as fundamental to their nature as the need for food or sleep. Those who fought against it too strenuously sometimes developed physical symptoms, headaches, insomnia, or mysterious ailments that no conventional treatment could cure. Only when they accepted their calling and began to actively pursue healing knowledge did these symptoms disappear. The recognition of the calling often came through dramatic events, a successful treatment that saved a life, a prophetic dream that revealed important information, or a moment of intuitive understanding that transcended normal human knowledge. But sometimes it emerged more gradually, through small acts of compassion and healing that accumulated over time until even the skeptics could no longer deny the individual's special gifts. In the monastery of St. Bartholomew, Brother Marcus first displayed his healing abilities when he successfully treated a fellow monk's infected wound using nothing more than honey and prayers. The monastery's infirmarian had already given the patient last rites, convinced that the spreading red streaks meant certain death. But Marcus felt compelled to try one more treatment, mixing honey with crushed garlic and applying it directly to the wound while maintaining a constant vigil of prayer. Against all expectations, the infection began to recede, and within a week, the monk had recovered completely. This incident established Brother Marcus as the monastery's unofficial healer, though he continued his regular duties as a scribe and illuminator. He began studying the medical texts in the monastery's library, copying ancient Greek and Roman treatises on medicine and adding his own observations in careful marginal notes. His reputation spread beyond the monastery walls, and soon people from surrounding villages were making pilgrimages to seek his help with ailments that local practitioners couldn't cure. The calling to heal was often accompanied by other unusual abilities that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. Many healers reported having prophetic dreams that revealed the location of rare medicinal plants or warned them about impending outbreaks of disease. Others claimed to be able to sense illness in people before any symptoms appeared, or to know instinctively when a patient was beyond help and should be allowed to die peacefully, rather than subjected to futile treatments. These supernatural aspects of healing made it even more difficult for church authorities to know how to respond. If the abilities were truly gifts from God, then suppressing them would be tantamount to rejecting divine grace. But if they came from darker sources, then allowing them to flourish could endanger the souls of both healers and their patients. This theological uncertainty created space for folk healers to operate. But it also meant that their position was never entirely secure. The path from recognizing the calling to becoming a skilled healer was neither straightforward nor safe. Unlike the formal apprenticeships available in other medieval trades, healing knowledge was passed down through secretive networks that operated largely outside official recognition. Those who showed promise had to find their way to masters willing to share their knowledge, often traveling great distances and facing considerable hardship along the way. The most common route into healing was through family connections. In villages throughout Europe, certain families had maintained healing traditions for generations, carefully preserving their knowledge despite periodic waves of persecution. These families operated like secret societies, with knowledge passed down through oral tradition and practical demonstration rather than written texts. The secrecy was necessary for survival, but it also meant that much valuable information was lost when family lines were broken by war, disease, or religious persecution. Meredith, the blacksmith's daughter from Thornwick, began her formal education when she turned 12, and her mother could no longer ignore the girl's obvious abilities. Word had spread through the region about Meredith's success in treating various ailments, and eventually reached the ears of Dame Celia, an elderly woman who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of Sherwood Forest. Dame Celia had once served as healer to a noble family, but political changes had forced her into retirement and relative isolation. The old woman arrived in Thornwick on a market day, moving through the crowd with the slow dignity of someone accustomed to respect, but no longer expecting it. She watched Meredith work for several hours as the girl helped her mother sell herbs and simple remedies from a small stall. Dame Celia observed how Meredith instinctively selected the freshest plants, how she seemed to know which customers needed which remedies without being told their symptoms, and most importantly, how she handled each transaction with a combination of confidence and humility that suggested deep wisdom despite her youth. When the market day ended, Dame Celia approached Meredith's parents with a proposition. She would take the girl as an apprentice, teaching her everything she knew about the healing arts in exchange for companionship and assistance in her declining years. The arrangement would last 7 years, after which Meredith would be free to establish her own practice or continue serving Dame Celia if she chose. It was an opportunity that few families in their social position would ever receive, but it also meant giving up their daughter during what should have been her prime marriageable years. After much discussion and prayer, Meredith's parents agreed to the arrangement, understanding that their daughter's gifts were too powerful to be wasted in conventional domesticity. The parting was tearful, but hopeful, with promises of regular visits and messages sent through traveling merchants. Meredith packed her few belongings and followed Dame Celia into the forest, beginning a journey that would transform her from a gifted child into a master healer. Dame Celia's cottage was unlike anything Meredith had ever seen. Built into a natural clearing where several ancient oak trees created a protective circle, it seemed to grow organically from the forest floor. The walls were made of local stone fitted together without mortar, held in place by careful engineering and the roots of climbing plants that had been trained to grow in specific patterns. The roof was thick thatch that had been waterproofed with a combination of pitch and some kind of plant extract that gave it a subtle green tinge. Inside, the cottage was divided into several rooms, each with its own specific purpose in the healing arts. The main room served as both living space and consultation area, with comfortable seating arranged around a large fireplace where Dame Celia could examine patients in good light. One wall was lined with shelves holding hundreds of jars, bottles, and wooden containers, each carefully labeled with symbols that Meredith would later learn represented different plants and their various preparations. The second room was dedicated to preparation and storage. Here, Dame Celia dried herbs, mixed remedies, and maintained the careful records that tracked which treatments worked best for different conditions. Long tables provided workspace for grinding, mixing, and bottling, while overhead racks held bundles of drying plants that filled the air with a complex symphony of aromas. Temperature and humidity were carefully controlled using a system of vents and moisture-absorbing materials that Dame Celia had perfected over decades of experience. The third room was perhaps the most important, Dame Celia's library. Unlike most medieval libraries, which were filled with religious texts and classical literature, this collection focused entirely on healing knowledge. There were hand-copied versions of ancient Greek and Roman medical treatises, collections of folk remedies gathered from across Europe, detailed drawings of anatomical structures, and most valuably, Dame Celia's own notebooks documenting 50 years of practical experience. Meredith's education began immediately upon her arrival, but not in the way she had expected. Rather than starting with book learning or formal instruction, Dame Celia put her to work maintaining the cottage and its surrounding gardens. Every task, no matter how mundane it seemed, was designed to teach important lessons about healing. When Meredith swept the preparation room, she learned to identify different herbs by their distinctive scents. When she tended the garden, she discovered which plants grew best in which locations and how to tell when they were ready for harvest. The garden itself was a marvel of practical botany. Dame Celia had spent years collecting seeds and cuttings from across Europe, creating a living pharmacy that contained hundreds of species with documented medicinal properties. The layout was carefully planned to take advantage of different soil conditions, sunlight patterns, and water availability. Plants with similar properties were grouped together to make identification and harvesting more efficient, while those with conflicting characteristics were kept separated to prevent cross-contamination. Each section of the garden told its own story about the history and development of healing knowledge. The Mediterranean section contained plants brought back by crusaders and merchants, rosemary for memory enhancement, lavender for calming nerves, and thyme for respiratory ailments. The Northern European section featured native plants that had been used by Celtic and Germanic tribes for centuries: white willow bark for pain relief, elderflower for fever reduction, and hawthorn berries for heart problems. Dame Celia's teaching method emphasized observation and experience over theoretical knowledge. Rather than lecturing about plant properties, she would have Meredith taste different preparations and note their effects on her own body. Rather than memorizing lists of symptoms and treatments, Meredith learned to observe patients carefully and trust her intuition about what they needed. This hands-on approach was slower than formal instruction, but it produced deeper understanding and more reliable skills. The learning process was complicated by the need for secrecy. Dame Celia had survived decades of practicing healing during periods when such activities were considered heretical by religious authorities. She had learned to be extremely cautious about who she trusted and how much information she shared. Even with Meredith, whom she came to love like a daughter, she revealed her most sensitive knowledge only gradually and after extensive testing of the girl's character and judgment. Some lessons could only be learned through direct experience with life and death situations. When a messenger arrived from a nearby village reporting an outbreak of fever, Dame Celia took Meredith along to observe her first major medical crisis. The village was in chaos, with entire families falling ill simultaneously and the local priest overwhelmed by requests for last rites. Dame Celia worked methodically through the affected households, teaching Meredith to triage patients by severity of symptoms and likelihood of recovery. The experience was traumatic for Meredith, who had never before seen suffering on such a scale. Several patients died despite Dame Celia's best efforts, and the girl struggled to understand how someone with such extensive knowledge and experience could still fail to save lives. Dame Celia used these failures as teaching opportunities, helping Meredith understand that healing was as much about accepting limitations as it was about pushing boundaries. Every healer must learn to live with loss, Dame Celia explained as they walked home through the forest after spending 3 days in the plague-stricken village. We save who we can, comfort those we cannot save, and learn from every case so that we might do better next time. The moment we begin to think ourselves infallible is the moment we become dangerous to our patients. The theoretical aspects of Meredith's education took place during the long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. Dame Celia would pull out her precious medical texts and guide Meredith through the accumulated wisdom of centuries of healing practice. They studied anatomical drawings copied from Greek sources, learned about the four humors and how imbalances between them cause disease, and memorized the properties of hundreds of different medicinal plants. But Dame Celia always emphasized that book learning was only the foundation for practical wisdom. The ancients knew much that we have forgotten, she would say. But they also believed much that experience has proven false. Your job is to take what is useful from their knowledge while developing your own understanding through careful observation and experimentation. This experimental approach was both liberating and terrifying for Meredith. Dame Celia encouraged her to modify traditional remedies based on her own observations, to try new combinations of ingredients, and to develop treatments for conditions that had previously been considered incurable. But experimentation meant the possibility of failure. And failure in healing often meant the loss of human life. The relationship between master and apprentice was unlike the formal hierarchies that governed other medieval trades. Dame Celia treated Meredith more like a junior partner than a servant, involving her in decision-making and encouraging her to question established practices. This collaborative approach reflected the unique nature of healing knowledge, which required creativity and judgment rather than mere technical skill. As Meredith's abilities developed, she began to attract her own patients who sought her out, specifically, rather than coming to see Dame Celia. This transition was handled carefully, with Dame Celia gradually stepping back to allow her apprentice to take the lead, while remaining available for consultation on difficult cases. The process built Meredith's confidence, while ensuring that patients continued to receive competent care. The final stage of Meredith's apprenticeship involved learning the business aspects of healing practice. Dame Celia taught her how to set fair prices for different services, how to manage supplies and inventory, and how to maintain the delicate relationships with local authorities that allowed healers to operate without interference. She also learned about the informal networks that connected healers across different regions, sharing information about new treatments and warning each other about political developments that might threaten their safety. After 6 years of intensive training, Meredith had become a skilled healer in her own right, capable of handling most medical situations independently. But Dame Celia's most important lessons were about the philosophical and ethical dimensions of healing practice. A true healer, she explained, was not merely someone who possessed medical knowledge, but someone who had accepted responsibility for using that knowledge wisely and compassionately in service to others. The medieval healer's arsenal was a carefully curated collection of natural materials, simple instruments, and accumulated wisdom that had been refined through generations of practical experience. Unlike modern practitioners who relied on standardized pharmaceuticals and precision instruments, medieval healers had to be part botanist, part chemist, part craftsman, and part artist, creating their own tools and preparations from whatever materials the natural world provided. Dame Celia's collection represented the accumulated resources of a lifetime spent in the healing arts. Her workshop contained hundreds of different substances, each stored in containers designed to preserve its potency and prevent contamination. Clay pots held dried herbs that needed protection from moisture, while glass bottles contained liquid extracts and tinctures that required protection from light. Wooden boxes lined with oiled cloth stored more delicate preparations, and metal containers held substances that might corrode other materials. The organization of this vast collection followed principles that Meredith came to understand were both practical and philosophical. Related plants were grouped together not just for convenience, but because healers believed that substances with similar properties could enhance each other's effectiveness when used in combination. The arrangement also reflected the doctrine of signatures, an ancient belief that plants revealed their medicinal purposes through their physical appearance. Yellow flowers for liver ailments, red berries for blood disorders, and heart-shaped leaves for cardiac problems. Each container bore careful labels written in a mixture of Latin, local dialect, and symbolic notations that Dame Celia had developed over years of practice. The symbols indicated not just what each substance was, but when it had been harvested, how it had been prepared, and what specific conditions it was most effective in treating. This information was crucial because the potency of natural medicines varied dramatically depending on factors like soil conditions, weather patterns, and the phase of the moon during harvest. The preparation tools were as important as the raw materials themselves. Dame Celia possessed mortars and pestles made from different materials, marble for grinding hard substances, wood for softer materials, and metal for preparations that required the introduction of metallic elements. Each tool had been selected and maintained with the understanding that contamination or improper preparation could render even the most potent ingredients useless or dangerous. The distillation equipment represented some of the most sophisticated technology available to medieval healers. Dame Celia's still was a complex arrangement of copper vessels, glass tubes, and clay containers that allowed her to extract essential oils and concentrated essences from plant materials. The process required precise control of temperature and timing, skills that had taken her years to master. The resulting products were far more potent than simple dried herbs and could be stored for longer periods without losing their effectiveness. But not all of Dame Celia's tools were physical objects. Much of her most valuable equipment existed in the form of knowledge, detailed understanding of which plants grew where, when to harvest them for maximum potency, and how to combine them for specific therapeutic effects. This information had been accumulated through decades of careful observation and experimentation, supplemented by knowledge passed down from previous generations of healers. The seasonal nature of plant medicine meant that much of a healer's year was spent in preparation for times when fresh materials would not be available. Spring brought the first tender shoots that were most effective when used fresh. Summer provided the full flowering plants whose blooms contained concentrated active compounds. Fall offered roots and seeds that could be stored through the winter months. Each season required different harvesting techniques and preservation methods. Meredith learned that successful plant collection was as much art as science. The time of day mattered. Many plants were most potent when gathered in the early morning before the sun had evaporated their essential oils. The phase of the moon was considered crucial, with different lunar cycles believed to enhance different properties. Weather conditions affected everything from the concentration of active compounds to the shelf life of preserved materials. The actual process of creating medicines from raw plants involved numerous steps, each requiring specific skills and careful attention to detail. Drying had to be done at the right temperature and humidity to preserve active compounds while preventing mold and deterioration. Grinding required understanding of which plant parts contained the desired properties and how fine the powder needed to be for different applications. Mixing demanded knowledge of which combinations enhanced effectiveness and which might produce dangerous interactions. Dame Celia's surgical instruments were crude by modern standards, but represented the best technology available to medieval practitioners. Her knives were made from high-quality steel that could be sharpened to a razor edge and maintained in sterile condition through careful cleaning and heating. Forceps allowed for precise manipulation of small objects and delicate tissues. Needles of various sizes enabled suturing of wounds and the administration of certain treatments through injection. The preparation of surgical instruments was a ritual in itself, reflecting the understanding that cleanliness was crucial for preventing infection. Dame Celia would heat her tools in the fire until they glowed red, then allow them to cool in a solution of wine and herbs that was believed to possess antiseptic properties. Modern science has validated many of these practices, confirming that medieval healers had developed effective sterilization techniques through empirical observation. Pain management during surgical procedures relied on a combination of alcohol, opium-based preparations, and various plant extracts that had sedative properties. Dame Celia maintained a carefully controlled supply of these substances, understanding that the difference between effective pain relief and dangerous overdose was often a matter of precise dosing. She had developed her own formulations that balanced effectiveness against safety, though every use still carried significant risks. The creation of specialized preparations required tools and techniques that bordered on alchemy. Dame Celia possessed equipment for creating metallic compounds that were believed to have special healing properties. Her collection included small quantities of mercury, antimony, and other substances that were thought to purify the blood and treat certain chronic conditions. The preparation of these medicines required extreme care, as many were toxic in even small quantities. Record-keeping was another essential tool in the healer's arsenal. Dame Celia maintained detailed notes about every patient she treated, recording symptoms, treatments prescribed, and outcomes achieved. These records allowed her to track the effectiveness of different approaches and identify patterns that might not be obvious in individual cases. Over time, this information became one of her most valuable resources, enabling her to refine her techniques and develop new treatments based on systematic observation. The tools for diagnosis were largely based on careful observation and physical examination. Dame Celia had trained herself to detect subtle changes in skin color, breathing patterns, and pulse characteristics that could indicate different types of illness. She possessed magnifying devices made from polished crystal that allowed detailed examination of wounds and skin conditions. Her sense of smell had been refined through years of practice to detect the distinctive odors associated with different diseases. The psychological tools of healing were perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Dame Celia's practice. She understood that a patient's mental state could significantly affect their physical recovery, and she had developed numerous techniques for providing comfort and maintaining hope during treatment. Her manner of speaking, the arrangement of her treatment rooms, and even her choice of clothing were all calculated to inspire confidence and promote healing. The portability of healing tools was a constant concern for practitioners who might need to travel to reach patients. Dame Celia maintained a traveling kit that contained the most essential items in compact, lightweight forms. Concentrated tinctures replaced bulky dried herbs, and multi-purpose tools eliminated the need for specialized equipment. This traveling kit allowed her to provide effective treatment even when working far from her fully equipped workshop. The cost and rarity of many healing materials meant that Dame Celia had to be extremely careful about waste and contamination. Some substances like imported spices with medicinal properties were worth more than their weight in silver. Others, like certain animal-derived preparations, required considerable time and effort to obtain. The loss of even small quantities of these materials could significantly impact her ability to help patients. The tools of the medieval healer reflected a worldview that saw healing as a holistic process involving not just the physical treatment of disease, but the restoration of harmony between the patient and the natural world. Every tool, from the simplest grinding stone to the most complex distillation apparatus, was understood to be part of a larger system that connected human health to the rhythms and cycles of the natural environment. Training with these tools required not just technical skill, but philosophical understanding of their proper use. Dame Celia taught Meredith that tools were extensions of the healer's knowledge and judgment, not replacements for them. The most sophisticated equipment was useless without the wisdom to know when and how to apply it, while simple tools in skilled hands could achieve remarkable results. As Meredith's expertise grew, she began to modify and improve upon the tools she had inherited from Dame Celia. She developed new preservation techniques that extended the shelf life of certain preparations, created more efficient methods for extracting active compounds from plants, and designed instruments that were better suited to her particular style of practice. This continuous innovation was considered essential for the advancement of healing knowledge. The inheritance of healing tools carried profound significance in medieval society. When an experienced healer died or retired, The disposition of their equipment and supplies often determined whether their knowledge would continue to benefit their community. Dame Celia had already begun the process of formally transferring ownership of her most valuable tools to Meredith, understanding that these resources represented generations of accumulated wisdom that must not be lost. The life of a medieval healer was shaped by the rhythms of human suffering, which recognized neither seasons nor schedules. Dame Celia and her apprentice Meredith rose each morning before dawn, never knowing whether the day would bring routine consultations about minor ailments or desperate summons to battle life-threatening emergencies. Their daily routine was built around this uncertainty, with careful preparation allowing them to respond effectively to whatever challenges might arise. The morning hours were typically devoted to preparation and maintenance tasks that kept their practice running smoothly. Dame Celia would begin by checking on any patients who had been left in their care overnight, monitoring their condition and adjusting treatments as needed. Meanwhile, Meredith tended to the gardens and workshops, harvesting fresh materials, checking the progress of preparations that were steeping or fermenting, and ensuring that their supplies of essential medicines remained adequate. The preparation of fresh remedies was a daily necessity, as many of the most effective treatments could not be stored for extended periods. Each morning brought decisions about which medicines to prepare, based on seasonal availability of ingredients, current patient needs, and weather conditions that might affect the stability of different preparations. This constant cycle of creation and renewal required both technical skill and careful planning. Breakfast was usually a simple meal taken while working, as both healers understood that emergencies could interrupt their routine at any moment. They had learned to eat efficiently and maintain their energy throughout long days that might involve extensive travel, physical demands of treating patients, and the mental strain of making life-and-death decisions. Their diet was supplemented with herbs and preparations that supported their own health and stamina. The first patients typically arrived shortly after sunrise, having traveled through the night to reach Dame Celia's cottage. These early visitors were often the most desperate cases, people whose conditions had worsened during the dark hours or whose families had finally overcome their reluctance to seek help from someone outside the traditional religious hierarchy. Dame Celia made it a practice to see these emergency cases immediately, regardless of other scheduled appointments. Each consultation followed a careful pattern that Dame Celia had refined through decades of experience. She would begin by listening to the patient's description of their symptoms, encouraging them to provide as much detail as possible about when the problem began, what made it better or worse, and how it was affecting their daily life. This process often revealed important information that patients might not have considered relevant to their condition. The physical examination that followed was thorough but respectful of medieval modesty customs. Dame Celia had developed techniques that allowed her to gather necessary information while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She had trained her hands to detect subtle changes in temperature, texture, and pulse that could indicate different types of illness. Her eyes had learned to spot the early signs of disease that less experienced observers might miss. Diagnosis in the medieval period was as much art as science, requiring healers to synthesize information from multiple sources to form accurate conclusions about their patients' conditions. Dame Celia would consider the patient's symptoms, physical findings, personal history, and environmental factors to develop what modern medicine would recognize as a differential diagnosis, a list of possible conditions that could explain the observed problems. The selection of appropriate treatments required extensive knowledge of both the patient's specific situation and the available therapeutic options. Dame Celia had to consider factors like the patient's age, overall health status, other medications they might be taking, and their ability to follow complex treatment regimens. She also had to balance the potential benefits of aggressive treatment against the risks of adverse reactions or complications. Treatment administration was often a collaborative process involving both the healer and the patient's family members. Dame Celia would provide detailed instructions about how to prepare and administer medicines, what signs to watch for that might indicate improvement or deterioration, and when to seek additional help. This educational component was crucial for ensuring that patients received consistent care between visits. The afternoon hours were typically devoted to house calls, as many patients were too ill to travel to Dame Celia's cottage. These visits required careful planning, as the healers had to carry all necessary supplies and equipment with them while traveling through countryside that could be dangerous for unescorted women. They had developed efficient packing systems that allowed them to transport a complete pharmacy in portable containers. House calls provided insights into patients' living conditions that were often crucial for understanding their health problems. Dame Celia could observe factors like sanitation, nutrition, family dynamics, and environmental hazards that might be contributing to illness. These observations often led to recommendations about lifestyle changes that could prevent future problems or support ongoing treatment efforts. The social aspects of healing practice were as important as the medical components. Dame Celia served not just as a healthcare provider, but as a counselor, confidant, and sometimes mediator in family disputes that affected her patients' well-being. She had learned to navigate complex social situations while maintaining the neutrality necessary for effective healing relationships. Evening hours were reserved for the most challenging cases, patients whose conditions had not responded to conventional treatments or who required intensive monitoring during critical phases of their illness. These sessions often lasted well into the night, with Dame Celia and Meredith taking turns maintaining constant vigilance over patients whose lives hung in the balance. The emotional toll of healing practice was considerable, particularly during epidemics or other crises, when healers were confronted with suffering they could not relieve despite their best efforts. Dame Celia had developed coping strategies that allowed her to maintain emotional equilibrium while remaining compassionate and effective. She taught Meredith that healers had to learn to grieve for their losses while celebrating their successes. Documentation of cases was an essential part of daily practice, though it had to be done carefully to avoid creating records that could be used against the healers by hostile authorities. Dame Celia maintained coded notes that recorded essential information about treatments and outcomes while obscuring details that might be considered heretical or suspicious. These records were invaluable for tracking long-term patient progress and refining treatment approaches. The business aspects of healing practice required constant attention to ensure that the healers could maintain their operations while serving patients who often had limited ability to pay. Dame Celia had developed a flexible payment system that accepted goods and services as well as money, understanding that healing had to remain accessible to all social classes if it was to serve its broader social function. Professional development was an ongoing process that required healers to continuously update their knowledge and skills. Dame Celia maintained correspondence with other healers throughout Europe, exchanging information about new treatments, emerging diseases, and political developments that might affect their practices. She also continued to study ancient texts and experiment with new approaches, understanding that healing knowledge was never complete or final. The teaching of apprentices was integrated into daily practice, with learning opportunities arising naturally from patient encounters. Meredith participated in all aspects of healing work, gradually taking on more responsibility as her skills developed. Dame Celia used each case as a teaching opportunity, explaining her reasoning and encouraging Meredith to develop her own diagnostic and treatment approaches. The relationship with local authorities required careful management, as healers operated in a legal gray area where their activities were neither fully sanctioned nor entirely prohibited. Dame Celia had learned to maintain cordial relationships with priests, magistrates, and other officials while avoiding actions that might provoke hostile attention. This diplomatic aspect of practice was essential for long-term survival. The physical demands of healing practice were considerable, requiring healers to maintain their own health and stamina despite irregular schedules, exposure to infectious diseases, and the stress of making life and death decisions. Dame Celia had developed personal health routines that included regular consumption of preventive medicines, physical exercises to maintain strength and flexibility, and meditation practices that helped manage stress and maintain mental clarity. The seasonal variations in healing practice reflected the natural rhythms of disease and wellness in medieval society. Winter brought respiratory illnesses and injuries from accidents and icy conditions, while summer saw increases in digestive problems and infections related to food spoilage. Spring epidemics often struck communities weakened by winter hardships, while fall brought harvest-related injuries and the urgent need to prepare medicines for the coming cold months. The integration of spiritual and physical healing was a constant aspect of medieval practice, reflecting the worldview of patients who saw illness as potentially involving both natural and supernatural causes. Dame Celia had learned to incorporate prayer and ritual into her treatments while maintaining focus on practical medical interventions. This holistic approach addressed patients' psychological and spiritual needs as well as their physical symptoms. The role of family members in healing was much more extensive than in modern medical practice, with relatives expected to provide much of the day-to-day care under the healer's guidance. Dame Celia spent considerable time training family members in basic nursing skills, teaching them to recognize signs of improvement or deterioration, and helping them understand how to support the healing process through proper nutrition, rest, and emotional support. The challenges of practicing healing in a largely illiterate society required special communication skills and teaching methods. Dame Celia had developed visual aids, simple songs, and memorable phrases that helped patients and their families remember important instructions about treatment and care. She also used symbolic systems that allowed people to keep track of dosing schedules and other complex information without needing to read or write. The networking aspects of healing practice were crucial for both professional development and patient referral. Dame Celia maintained relationships with healers specializing in different areas: bone setters for fractures, midwives for childbirth complications, and herbalists with expertise in rare conditions. These professional relationships allowed her to provide comprehensive care by coordinating with other practitioners when cases exceeded her own expertise. The legal and ethical dimensions of healing practice required careful navigation of complex moral and practical issues. Dame Celia had to make decisions about treating patients who couldn't pay, managing confidential information about her patients' conditions, and balancing individual patient needs against broader community health concerns. These challenges were complicated by the informal legal status of healing practice. The preparation for retirement or succession was an ongoing concern for healers who understood that their knowledge and patient relationships represented valuable community resources that should not be lost. Dame Celia had begun this process years before Meredith's arrival, gradually documenting her most important treatments and building relationships that would support a smooth transition of care responsibilities. As evening approached each day, Dame Celia and Meredith would review the day's cases, discussing what had gone well and what could be improved. These conversations served multiple purposes. They helped consolidate learning, identify patterns in their practice, and maintain the emotional connection that made their demanding work sustainable. The day would end with careful preparation for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, knowing that in the world of medieval healing, the only certainty was uncertainty. The practice of healing in medieval Europe was fraught with perils that extended far beyond the medical risks inherent in treating disease with primitive tools and limited knowledge. Every healer lived under the constant shadow of suspicion, knowing that a single accusation of witchcraft, heresy, or supernatural dealings could transform them from respected community members into hunted fugitives facing torture, imprisonment, or death. The relationship between healers and the established church was perhaps the most treacherous aspect of medieval medical practice. While practical necessity forced church officials to tolerate folk healing, priests possessed little practical medical knowledge despite their theoretical authority. Over all aspects of spiritual and physical well-being, the theological implications of non-clerical healing remained deeply problematic for religious authorities. Dame Celia had witnessed firsthand how quickly political and religious climates could shift, transforming healers from valued community resources into dangerous heretics. In her youth, during a period of relative tolerance, she had practiced openly and even maintained friendly relationships with local clergy who appreciated her ability to treat conditions that prayer and holy water could not cure. But she had also lived through the terrible years when religious zealots swept through the countryside, conducting witch trials that claimed the lives of dozens of healers along with countless other innocent people accused of supernatural crimes. The accusations against healers typically followed predictable patterns that reflected deep-seated anxieties about the sources of healing power. If a treatment succeeded where conventional approaches had failed, critics might claim that the success came from demonic assistance rather than superior medical knowledge. If a treatment failed and the patient died, the healer could be accused of murder, incompetence, or deliberate harm inflicted through supernatural means. The very effectiveness of herbal medicine created suspicions about its practitioners. In a worldview that attributed all genuine healing power to divine intervention channeled through ordained priests, the consistent success of folk remedies seemed to require explanation through supernatural means. Healers who achieved better results than religious healing rituals were particularly vulnerable to accusations of having made pacts with dark forces. The botanical knowledge that formed the foundation of medieval healing was itself considered suspect by some religious authorities. The ability to identify hundreds of different plants, understand their properties, and combine them in effective treatments seemed almost superhuman to people who lacked such training. Critics questioned how anyone could possess such extensive knowledge without supernatural assistance, particularly when many healers were women who were supposedly incapable of such intellectual achievements. Dame Celia had developed elaborate strategies for protecting herself from these dangers, understanding that survival required not just medical competence, but political wisdom and social sensitivity. She maintained careful relationships with local religious authorities, regularly consulting with priests about difficult cases and deferring to their judgment on matters that might involve spiritual dimensions. She made generous donations to the church and ensured that her public statements always emphasized her dependence on divine providence for her healing successes. The practice of incorporating Christian symbolism and prayers into healing rituals was both genuine religious devotion and practical protection strategy. Dame Celia would bless her medicines in the name of the Trinity, make the sign of the cross before beginning treatments, and encourage her patients to pray for divine assistance during their recovery. These practices demonstrated her orthodoxy while acknowledging the theological principle that all healing ultimately came from God. But even the most careful precautions could not guarantee safety when political winds shifted or local conflicts created scapegoats for community problems. Dame Celia had learned to recognize early warning signs of trouble, changes in the attitudes of local officials, increased scrutiny of her activities, or whispers about supernatural explanations for recent deaths or disasters. When these signs appeared, she would temporarily reduce her public activities and sometimes leave the area entirely until tensions subsided. The informal nature of healing practice meant that healers had no legal protections or official recognition that might shield them from persecution. Unlike members of guilds or other established professions, healers operated outside the formal structures of medieval society, making them vulnerable to arbitrary accusations and punishment. Their effectiveness and independence from established authorities made them convenient targets when community leaders needed to demonstrate their commitment to religious orthodoxy. The gender dynamics of medieval society created additional dangers for female healers, who comprised the majority of folk practitioners. Women who displayed unusual knowledge or independence were automatically suspect in a culture that expected female submission to male authority. The stereotype of the wise woman as potential witch was deeply embedded in medieval consciousness, making it relatively easy for critics to transform respected healers into feared outcasts. The economic tensions surrounding healing practice also created opportunities for persecution. Successful healers often accumulated wealth and influence that could provoke envy or resentment from other community members. Competitors might spread rumors about supernatural practices, while patients who felt overcharged might seek revenge through accusations of witchcraft. The informal nature of most financial arrangements made it difficult for healers to defend themselves against claims of exploitation or fraud. Dame Celia had survived several close calls over the decades, incidents where accusations or investigations had threatened to destroy her life and practice. In one particularly dangerous episode, a patient's death had been attributed to her treatments by family members who refused to accept that the disease had been incurable. The accusations had reached local church authorities, leading to an investigation that examined her methods, questioned her patients, and searched her home for evidence of supernatural practices. The investigation had been both terrifying and humiliating, as Dame Celia was forced to justify every aspect of her practice to authorities who possessed little understanding of healing principles, but wielded absolute power over her fate. She had been required to demonstrate her preparation methods, explain her diagnostic techniques, and provide detailed accounts of her treatment decisions. Throughout the process, she had maintained careful deference to religious authority while subtly educating her interrogators about the natural principles underlying her work. Her survival had depended partly on the testimony of grateful patients who spoke on her behalf, partly on her own careful documentation of orthodox practices, and partly on the intervention of influential supporters who valued her services. But the experience had taught her that safety was never guaranteed, and that even the most successful healer was only one accusation away from disaster. The strategies for managing these dangers required constant vigilance and careful calibration of behavior to match local political and religious conditions. Dame Celia had learned to vary her practices based on the personalities and attitudes of local authorities, maintaining different approaches for different communities while ensuring that her core medical effectiveness remained consistent. The networking among healers served partly as an early warning system for identifying and responding to emerging threats. Information about investigations, accusations, and persecution in one area would spread quickly through informal channels, allowing healers elsewhere to adjust their practices or relocate if necessary. This communication network was itself dangerous, as it could be interpreted as evidence of organized conspiracy against established authority. The training of apprentices like Meredith included extensive education about recognizing and managing these dangers. Dame Celia taught her student not just medical techniques, but political awareness, social sensitivity, and the survival skills necessary for practicing healing in a hostile environment. This education was perhaps the most crucial aspect of apprentice training, as medical knowledge was useless to practitioners who did not survive to apply it. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of persecution was considerable, requiring healers to develop mental resilience and emotional coping strategies. Dame Celia had learned to compartmentalize her fears, maintaining confidence in her healing work while acknowledging the reality of external dangers. She had also developed philosophical frameworks that helped her understand persecution as part of the larger struggle between knowledge and ignorance, progress and tradition. The impact of persecution on the development of healing knowledge was profound, as the need for secrecy and caution slowed the accumulation and transmission of medical understanding. Healers were reluctant to document their most effective treatments, share information with potential competitors, or experiment with innovative approaches that might attract dangerous attention. This climate of fear undoubtedly delayed medical progress and cost countless lives that might have been saved by more open scientific inquiry. Despite these dangers, Dame Celia had never considered abandoning her calling, understanding that the risks to herself had to be weighed against the suffering she could relieve through her practice. She had developed a philosophical acceptance of danger as the price of meaningful work, finding purpose and satisfaction in her healing activities that outweighed the constant anxiety about potential persecution. This commitment to service despite personal risk was perhaps the defining characteristic of medieval healers who continued their work in the face of overwhelming opposition. The influence of medieval healers on the development of modern medicine was far more profound and lasting than most people realize, though much of their contribution remained hidden for centuries beneath layers of superstition, persecution, and deliberate suppression by established authorities. The knowledge and techniques developed by practitioners like Dame Celia formed crucial foundations for later medical advances, even when their origins were forgotten or deliberately obscured. The botanical knowledge accumulated by generations of folk healers represented one of humanity's first systematic attempts to understand the medicinal properties of the natural world. Long before the development of modern pharmacology, healers had identified hundreds of plants with therapeutic effects and developed sophisticated methods for extracting, concentrating, and preserving their active compounds. Many of today's most important medications are either derived directly from plants that medieval healers used, or are synthetic versions of compounds they discovered through empirical observation. Dame Celia's carefully maintained records, hidden though they were from hostile authorities, contained detailed observations about plant properties, optimal harvesting times, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications that would not be scientifically validated until centuries later. Her documentation of which treatments worked for different conditions, what dosages were effective, and how various substances interacted with each other represented a form of clinical research that predated formal medical science by hundreds of years. The surgical techniques developed by medieval healers were similarly advanced beyond what official medical authorities of their time acknowledged. Dame Celia's methods for wound cleaning, infection prevention, and tissue repair incorporated principles that would not be formally recognized until the development of antiseptic surgery in the 19th century. Her understanding of anatomy, gained through careful observation rather than formal dissection, was often more accurate than the theoretical knowledge taught in medieval universities. The holistic approach to healing that characterized medieval folk practice also anticipated modern understanding of the connections between physical health, mental state, and social environment. Dame Celia's attention to her patients' emotional needs, family relationships, and living conditions reflected an intuitive grasp of principles that contemporary medicine has rediscovered through research into psychosomatic illness, social determinants of health, and the importance of patient-centered care. The preservation and transmission of this knowledge occurred through informal networks that operated largely outside official recognition. Healers like Dame Celia maintained correspondence with practitioners across Europe, sharing information about new treatments, emerging diseases, and effective practices. These networks functioned as primitive but effective systems for disseminating medical knowledge, ensuring that useful discoveries spread throughout the healing community, despite the lack of formal publication or institutional support. The apprenticeship system through which healers passed their knowledge to the next generation created chains of learning that connected ancient wisdom to modern practice. Meredith's training under Dame Celia linked her to generations of healers stretching back to pre-Christian traditions, while simultaneously preparing her to contribute to ongoing medical development. This continuity ensured that valuable knowledge was not lost during periods of persecution or social upheaval. The integration of healing knowledge into monastery and university settings represented another pathway through which folk medicine influenced formal medical development. Monks who served as infirmarians often learned techniques from local healers, incorporating effective practices into their own medical treatments. These hybrid approaches combine traditional healing methods with theological frameworks, creating forms of medical practice that were more acceptable to religious authorities while preserving essential therapeutic knowledge. The influence of medieval healers on the development of chemistry and pharmacology was particularly significant, as their work with plant extracts, distillation, and chemical combinations laid groundwork for later scientific advances. Dame Celia's equipment and techniques for creating concentrated medicines were direct ancestors of modern pharmaceutical manufacturing processes. Her understanding of how different substances could be combined to create more effective treatments anticipated the principles of modern drug development. The documentation methods developed by healers to record their observations and preserve their knowledge also contributed to the evolution of scientific methodology. Dame Celia's careful notation of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes represented an early form of clinical record-keeping that emphasized empirical observation over theoretical speculation. Her systematic approach to tracking patient progress and refining treatments based on results embodied scientific principles that would not be formally articulated until much later. The ethical frameworks that governed medieval healing practice established important precedents for modern medical ethics. Dame Celia's commitment to treating all patients regardless of their ability to pay, her emphasis on informed consent and patient autonomy, and her recognition of the healer's obligation to do no harm, were principles that would later be incorporated into formal codes of medical ethics. Her understanding of the importance of maintaining patient confidentiality and avoiding conflicts of interest anticipated modern professional standards. The economic models developed by folk healers to sustain their practices while ensuring accessibility to all social classes influenced later thinking about healthcare delivery and financing. Dame Celia's flexible payment systems, her willingness to provide charity care, and her recognition that community health was ultimately more important than individual profit established patterns that would be reflected in various forms of socialized medicine and public health initiatives. The political struggles faced by medieval healers in their conflicts with established authorities provided important lessons about the relationship between medical knowledge and social power. Dame Celia's experiences with persecution and her strategies for survival highlighted issues of professional autonomy, scientific freedom, and the tension between innovation and tradition that continue to influence healthcare policy and medical practice today. The educational innovations developed by healers to train their successors anticipated many features of modern medical education. Dame Celia's combination of theoretical instruction, practical experience, mentorship, and progressive responsibility created a learning model that emphasized competency-based advancement and real-world application of knowledge. Her recognition of the importance of continuing education and professional development established patterns that remain central to medical training. The international networks that connected healers across different regions and cultures facilitated the exchange of medical knowledge that would later contribute to the globalization of healthcare. Dame Celia's correspondence with practitioners from different countries created pathways for the transmission of therapeutic techniques, plant knowledge, and treatment innovations that enriched the healing traditions of all participating cultures. The research methodologies developed by medieval healers, though informal by modern standards, established important precedents for clinical investigation. Dame Celia's systematic testing of different treatments, her careful observation of patient responses, and her documentation of results represented early forms of clinical research that contributed to the accumulation of medical knowledge. Her willingness to modify established practices based on empirical evidence anticipated the experimental approach that would later become central to scientific medicine. The impact of medieval healing traditions on the development of nursing as a professional discipline was particularly significant. The emphasis on patient care, family education, and preventive health measures that characterized folk healing practice established patterns that would later be incorporated into formal nursing education and practice. Dame Celia's recognition of the importance of emotional support, environmental factors, and patient advocacy anticipated many of the core values of modern nursing. The preservation of this legacy required extraordinary dedication and courage from practitioners who understood that they were custodians of knowledge that could benefit future generations. Dame Celia's commitment to documenting her practices, training apprentices, and maintaining connections with other healers ensured that her contributions to medical knowledge would survive even if she did not. Her recognition that healing knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to individuals reflected a philosophical commitment to service that transcended personal interests. As Dame Celia aged and began to contemplate the end of her active practice, she intensified her efforts to ensure that her life's work would continue to benefit others. Her careful preparation of Meredith to assume leadership of their practice was part of a larger commitment to maintaining the continuity of healing knowledge across generations. She understood that each generation of healers had an obligation to preserve the wisdom they had inherited while contributing their own discoveries to the ever-growing body of medical understanding. Even as Dame Celia's knowledge passed to Meredith and through her to future generations of healers, certain mysteries remained forever beyond the reach of understanding. There were formulations whose effectiveness no one could fully explain, treatments that worked for reasons that seemed to transcend natural law, and healing powers that appeared to emerge from sources deeper than mere botanical knowledge or technical skill. In her final years of active practice, Dame Celia often reflected on the aspects of healing that had remained mysterious throughout her long career. Despite decades of careful observation and systematic documentation, she had encountered phenomena that defied rational explanation, while producing undeniable therapeutic results. These mysteries had shaped her understanding of healing as much as her accumulated knowledge, teaching her that the boundaries between science and mystery were far more fluid than most people realized. One of the most persistent mysteries involved the question of why identical treatments produce different results in different patients. Dame Celia had observed cases where patients with seemingly identical conditions received exactly the same remedies, prepared with the same materials and administered with the same care, yet experienced completely different outcomes. Some recovered quickly and completely, others showed gradual improvement, and still others failed to respond at all despite having conditions that should have been easily treatable. This variability had led Dame Celia to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of individual constitution and the subtle factors that influenced healing response. She had learned to observe patients not just for obvious symptoms but for countless small details: the texture of their skin, the rhythm of their breathing, the way they moved and spoke, that seemed to correlate with their likelihood of responding to different treatments. Yet even this refined approach could not entirely predict or control therapeutic outcomes. The role of belief and expectation in healing had provided another source of mystery throughout Dame Celia's career. She had witnessed numerous cases where patients' faith in their treatment appeared to contribute significantly to their recovery, while skepticism or despair seemed to undermine even the most carefully administered therapies. The mechanisms behind these psychological influences remained opaque, but their reality was undeniable. Dame Celia had learned to work with these psychological factors as carefully as she managed the physical aspects of treatment. She had developed techniques for inspiring confidence, maintaining hope during difficult recoveries, and helping patients mobilize their own healing resources. Yet she remained puzzled by the precise ways in which mental states influenced physical processes and could never entirely predict which patients would benefit most from psychological interventions. The timing of healing interventions had proven to be another realm of mystery that defied complete understanding. Dame Celia had observed that identical treatments could produce dramatically different results depending on when they were administered, not just in relation to the disease process, but in relation to lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and other natural rhythms that seemed to influence therapeutic effectiveness in ways that no theory could adequately explain. This had led her to develop an almost intuitive sense of timing that guided her treatment decisions in ways she could never fully articulate to her apprentices. She would sometimes delay treatments that logic suggested should be administered immediately, or rush to provide interventions that seemed premature based on subtle impressions that she learned to trust despite their mysterious nature. The question of healing energy and its transmission had remained one of the most profound mysteries of Dame Celia's practice. She had long observed that some healers possessed an almost tangible presence that seemed to promote healing in ways that extended beyond their technical knowledge or bedside manner. Patients would often improve more rapidly when treated by these gifted practitioners, even when the actual treatments administered were identical to those provided by other healers. Dame Celia had experienced this phenomenon herself, noting that her own healing effectiveness seemed to vary according to factors that had nothing to do with her knowledge or skill level. During periods of personal harmony and spiritual balance, her treatments appeared more successful, while times of stress or emotional turmoil seemed to diminish her therapeutic effectiveness. The mechanisms behind these variations remained completely mysterious, yet their practical importance was unmistakable. The inheritance of healing abilities through family lines had provided another source of ongoing mystery. Dame Celia had observed that certain families consistently produced individuals with exceptional healing gifts, while others never seemed to develop such talents despite extensive training and opportunity. The patterns of inheritance did not follow simple genetic principles. Gifted healers might have children with no healing abilities, while extraordinary practitioners sometimes emerged from families with no prior healing tradition. This had led Dame Celia to speculate about spiritual or energetic factors that might influence the development of healing abilities across generations. She had observed that adopted children sometimes developed healing gifts similar to their adoptive parents, while biological children of great healers sometimes showed no such talents. These observations suggested that healing ability might be transmitted through mechanisms that transcended simple biological inheritance. The relationship between healing and the natural world had remained mysteriously complex throughout Dame Celia's career. She had learned that the effectiveness of plant medicines was influenced by countless environmental factors: soil conditions, weather patterns, harvesting methods, storage techniques, in ways that could never be completely controlled or predicted. Two batches of the same remedy, prepared with identical techniques from apparently similar materials, might produce significantly different therapeutic results for reasons that remained opaque. This had taught Dame Celia to approach her work with profound humility, recognizing that she was working with forces and principles that extended far beyond human understanding or control. She had learned to collaborate with natural processes rather than attempting to dominate them, developing an attitude of respectful partnership with the healing powers of the natural world. The mystery of spontaneous healing had provided some of Dame Celia's most memorable and puzzling experiences. She had witnessed cases where patients recovered from supposedly incurable conditions without any treatment, or where treatments that should have been ineffective produced miraculous results. These cases had taught her that healing involved factors and processes that remained completely beyond human comprehension or control. Rather than diminishing her commitment to careful practice and systematic knowledge, these mysterious aspects of healing had actually strengthened Dame Celia's dedication to her work. She understood that the existence of mystery did not negate the importance of knowledge, but rather provided a context within which human understanding could contribute to larger processes of healing and renewal. The preservation of mysteries along with established knowledge had become one of Dame Celia's most important concerns as she prepared to pass her practice to Meredith. She recognized that future generations of healers would need not only technical knowledge, but also the wisdom to work respectfully with the unknown aspects of healing. This required maintaining an attitude of humble inquiry that balanced confidence in proven methods with openness to phenomena that transcended current understanding. Dame Celia's final teachings to Meredith emphasized the importance of embracing mystery as an essential aspect of healing practice. She encouraged her successor to continue documenting observations and refining techniques, while remaining open to experiences that could not be easily categorized or explained. This balance between systematic knowledge and mysterious wisdom would be essential for maintaining the full depth and effectiveness of the healing tradition. The continuation of healing knowledge through generations of practitioners had itself become a kind of mystery that transcended individual lives and careers. Dame Celia understood that she was participating in a tradition that stretched back through countless generations of healers, each contributing their own discoveries while preserving wisdom inherited from their predecessors. This continuity represented something larger than any individual practitioner could fully comprehend or control. As Dame Celia's active career drew to a close and Meredith prepared to assume full responsibility for their practice, both women understood that they were custodians of mysteries as well as knowledge. The healing tradition they represented involved not just the accumulation of therapeutic techniques, but the preservation of wonder, humility, and respect for the profound mysteries of life, death, and renewal that would forever remain beyond complete human understanding. The greatest mystery of all, Dame Celia had come to believe, was the healing impulse itself, the drive to ease suffering and promote wellness that seemed to be embedded in the fundamental structure of human nature. This impulse had motivated countless generations of healers to dedicate their lives to serving others despite persecution, danger, and the constant confrontation with human mortality. Its source and ultimate purpose remained completely mysterious, yet its reality was the foundation upon which all healing practice was built. In her final years, Dame Celia found profound meaning in the recognition that she had spent her life participating in something far greater than individual knowledge or achievement. The mysterious tradition of healing that had shaped her existence would continue long after her death, carried forward by practitioners like Meredith, who would add their own contributions to the eternal human quest to understand and alleviate suffering. This continuity represented perhaps the greatest mystery and the most profound hope that the healing tradition could offer to a world forever in need of both knowledge and compassion.